When I was a kid, about 9, 10 years old, I used to go over to my grandmother's during the summer. Now, Grandma wasn't around a lot. She was living in an old folks' home, and there was lots of activities that I couldn't do. Bingo, bunco, multiple meals. So what I would do is I would hang out in her little closet. And in the closet, she kept her books. There were some Zane Grey pieces, some of my cousin's Sweet Valley High books, which I enjoyed. But the ones I dug into were the 3 shelves worth of Harlequin romances. Now, for a kid of 10, Harlequin romances, even in the 80s, were kinda stale. But they were definitely not literature. And literature, I mean the type they taught in colleges until recently when it became popular to teach the stuff people actually read. Now, Harlequin Enterprises is a Canadian company. Didn't know that. And it was founded in 1949 by Richard Bonnycastle. If ever there was a romance novel name, it's Bonnycastle. And he was actually a brigadier in the British Army who came to Canada after the Second World War. A lot of Canadians did that. Well, a lot of Brits who became Canadians did that. Now, it was created as sort of a reprint operation, and these were very popular after World War II. When this is sort of what happened. Americans came over and they were given books. And a lot of authors became fairly popular over there who weren't regularly published. In particular, you can see this in France with William Saroyan. But there were a number of authors that was the case. So reprint operations became hugely impressive, not only in books, but also in comics and magazines. And this is one of the big things in Ireland. My buddy James is doing a whole series on comics that came over to Ireland and were banned in magazines. Things like True Confessions, Truth, Young Love, all these things. Really a fascinating story. But these were often condensed versions that they were publishing. And it was a paperback deal. And those in the 1950s and even into the 60s, paperbacks were cheaply made. And often they were cut down versions of the full ones to sort of satisfy the format. You can't have an inch-thick paperback, at least not back then. So throughout the early 50s, Harlequin published all sorts of things. Crime novels, western, adventure stories, general fiction. They tended towards genre. And the books always had to be between 150 and 200 pages. Anyone who knows a fair bit about books know that typically pages are arranged into quires, 24 pages. So usually you want to get between 192 pages on the high end. On the low end, you want to have 144, somewhere around there. It's awkward. But they would be publishing this, and all the editorial decisions that were made to do 2 things: to keep printing prices low and to maintain low retail prices. Keeping the price low was utterly important, because this is really the paperback explosion that's happening in the 50s and 60s. Now, they were also, all the titles were chosen for 2 things. They had to be fast, you had to be able to read them quick, and they had to have broad appeal. And it really wasn't about the authors so much, or any sort of literary aspirations. It was about getting books in people's hands and selling books. Now, in 1957, Harlequin got into a deal with, for North American distribution, with a publishing group called Mills and Boon. And Mills and Boon is old, over 100 years. I think it was founded in 1910, 1909, somewhere in there. And it specialized in romantic fiction ever since after the First World War. And they came up with sort of this incredibly standardized form. And so what Harlequin started doing is it started issuing all the Mills and Boon titles in Canada and the US under the Harlequin umbrella. And these became much more popular. They were selling very quickly. And part of the reason why we have this sort of image of the 1950s, of the, 1950s housewife in her pearls and her lovely little house dress, reading romance novels, is because they were so cheap and so widely available. And initially they were sort of just a part of the deal. But as sales increased, they became more and more of what Harlequin was doing. They were selling in much more reliably and in higher volumes in mysteries, westerns, or adventure novels. And part of that might be that there were other publishers in those areas, in particularly mysteries, that were doing very well. And that were using the same model, but exclusively selling in those areas. And I should probably mention at this point, we were also seeing the smut paperback was arising here. Things like Greenleaf Classics. I'll do a whole episode, maybe even two, about my buddy Earl Kemp. But romance was the strongest category by 1960. And everything started to shift at that point, moving more and more towards selling just romance books. In 1961, Harlequin made the decision to discontinue almost every one of their non-romance lines. And it reorganized its production schedule so that every month they could have romance releases. And they took the Mills and Boon model, and they had incredibly tight word counts. Cover formats that was sort of, you knew it had to sort of follow these sort of guidelines for what each book was so that it fit with the design of the Harlequin brand. And they were publishing their own stuff now. It wasn't just reprinting. They were doing some of that, of course. But it was a specialized publishing empire. It was the core of Harlequin romance. Now, in the early 60s, it sort of refined retail logics. And this is amazing. I didn't realize this was the case, but they distributed primarily through drugstores and grocery chains. And they were displayed on spinner racks that were designed for super fast turnover. And what I love is that they were not the first to do it, but they were one of the leading groups that made stripping of books very, very important. So what you would do is, when your books weren't sold, you would strip the cover and you would send the cover back, the front cover, as a non-sale, and you would just, get rid of the rest of the pages. So you could measure performance by how many covers you got back. And that allowed you to sort of fine-tune your print runs. A lot of times, those covers were sent, but the internal book was actually passed around, sometimes even sold. Occasionally, it would be rebound in library style. So you can find some today, even at yard sales and such, that, it's a cover, it's a non-standard cover. Usually it's a hard sort of cardboard cover that was made so that they could sell books that they got for free as an unsold copy. Scheduled releases, formatting, predictable reader expectations. That's what Harlequin did. Now, it wasn't really commissioning original manuscripts just for the North American market, but it wasn't experimenting anymore either, and they started to get into that realm in the late 60s to actively commissioning new works. And they still very much got books from the Mills and Boon's writers. Authors like Anne Hampson, Violet Winspear, Ann Mather. And they were, regular fixtures in the catalog. If you've ever read any of their books, Ann Mather books are terrible. They really are. They're awful. I've only read one Violet Winspear, and I think that was because I was working on a piece on Harlequin romances of the period. But, yeah, Ann Mather books are awful. I've read more than a few. Now, in 1971, Harlequin formally became Harlequin Romance, and it had numbered monthly series. Now, it was definitely exactly what Mills and Boon were doing in the UK, but they were under much tighter internal control. Fixed length again, defined romantic arc. Love had to win at the end. That's the key. And you had some fairly significant titles in this point. The Italian Surgeon by Anne Hampson. Again, awful. Violet Winspear's The Silver Leopard, which is the one that I read, was pretty darn good. But none of them were written to be great literature. They were all meant to be quickly eaten and moved past. Now, what's interesting is that they had a set of internal guidelines, and every manuscript was set up against them. And if you strayed even a little bit off of the norms, you'd be punted. Now, in 1974, Harlequin published No Quarter Asked by Janet Daly. And that was actually the first American author who wrote specifically for the Harlequin romance line. Now, what's interesting is that Daly was literally put on the job because reader feedback said that readers wanted an American experience in their books and no more, or at least less, British and European settings. And massively successful. One of the most successful of all the books up to that point. And it also demonstrated that they could do that. They could go America. Now, this was the period where Harlequin became the Harlequin romance that we know today. Or at least knew. They didn't need external catalogs. They didn't need external locations and concepts. An American romance novel voice was being formed. And yes, there have been American romance novels all the way back. But this is really a very particular type. And a type that survives to today. And this highly standardized book, you know, I could spot a Harlequin romance at 50 feet. If I'm wearing my glasses. And, you know, you'd get 50,000 words. And they would come out monthly, and there would be sequential numbers all printed on the spine, so you would know. And they all sort of went like this. It opened with an introduction of a female protagonist whose circumstances were very constrained. She was very much in a box. Often employed in a recognizable occupation, like nurse, secretary, governess, administrative assistant, or being placed in a really sort of servant role that justified her proximity to the male lead, who was usually gruff, at least somewhat dismissive. He was financially secure, usually older, and almost always either a doctor, landowner, or executive. And the early chapters sort of give this sort of emotional distance, which is usually out of class differential or hierarchy. Sometimes it's about mistaking the character of the other one because of some trait. You know, and the narrative perspective was limited third person, usually closer aligned to the heroine's viewpoint. And that allowed the story to sort of get the emotional interpretation of events with sort of a distance that allowed a mystery to take place in a way. Not necessarily like a, oh, you have to solve it mystery, but like some sort of secret desire or something like that. But always, physical intimacy was almost nil. And you got all of your romantic tension through dialogue, which was cool. Now, usually settings were modern day. They could be anywhere. Sometimes they would be, you know, in Europe. Sometimes they'd be in America. Usually rural estates. Very popular. But every subplot was subservient to the main romantic arc. It was window dressing. And they were all utterly predictable. You always knew how they were going to end. Usually with a marriage proposal, but always with, you know, we are going to end up together for the rest of our lives. And what's interesting is that the editors treated it as kind of each piece as a cog in a machine. That Harlequin romances were the machine. And any individual book could be swapped out for another one. And in the 80s, they sort of realized something that they could, now that they had the general romance reader, they could go for more niche audiences. The most important was the launch of Harlequin Presents, which came out in 1980. And they were short, tightly structured, but they were usually of a higher class of protagonists. And here you had people like Ann Mather and Penny Jordan. And Penny Jordan actually is a very good writer. I've read probably half a dozen things by Penny Jordan and actually will not say she's anything but an excellent writer. You also had the rise of things like Harlequin Super Romance, which were much longer, sometimes as many as 100,000 words, but they were marketed as sort of fuller narratives. And they had more expanded stuff and all over the place. I don't know if I ever read any of those. But they were also the expensive ones, so that might be why I never read them. You also had things, they were theming things around location. There was the American Romance, which came out in 1984. Again, Janet Daly was writing for them. But what happened, one thing is that as the culture shifted, very slowly Harlequin also moved. Always, the requirement for a positive resolution, romantic resolution to the story was always needed. But you could have, as time went on, more acknowledgement of sexuality. It couldn't be explicit, but you could have some sort of, it's not just about this highfalutin, chivalric romance anymore. There's also a desire component about it. Now, by the mid-'80s, they were doing these sort of parallel romance lines. Each had its own length requirements, cover design conventions. In a way, all of them were their own Harlequin. And this is where Harlequin killed it. They absolutely killed it when they were able to control different aspects of the readership. The one thing they didn't have was what companies like Greenleaf had, was a specific sexual viewpoint. Now, by the late 80s, things started to change. They started to be getting challenged, and Simon & Schuster launched Silhouette Books in 1981, and it kept on growing, and they got works by Nora Roberts. The Irish Thoroughbred is worth reading. Sandra Brown. And Sandra Brown, interesting. I'm familiar with Sandra Brown's writing. I didn't realize she wrote under the name Laura Jordan. And she sold really well. I can remember Laura Jordan books for sure. I don't think I ever read any of them. But they were much snappier. They were not sexual yet. And eventually Harlequin bought Silhouette Books, but sort of still gave it its own sort of realm. But Silhouette had actually had several sections, including Silhouette Desire and Silhouette Special Edition. And these were the big sellers, honestly. They emphasized wealth, ambition, and sexual tension. In particular, that was Desire. And this is where you can see that Harlequin recognizes that sex can sell. And they were still trying to figure out how to fold it in. Again, Ann Mather wrote a lot of those. And, competition got bigger. And other publishers, like Avon and Zebra, which was an imprint of Kensington, they could release longer novels with explicit sexual content and recurring protagonists. That's a key. Recurring protagonists had always existed in things like mystery novels, science fiction. All you have to do is think of Buck Rogers, Lensman, Bulldog Drummond, Sam Spade. You had recurring, but you didn't have that in romance. Largely because the idea was, once the romance happened, it lasted forever, so you didn't have to revisit those characters. And eventually, Harlequin started to allow more sexual nature to come through, but no explicit description. And one of the things is a lot of people started to realize that once you were pigeonholed as a romance author, you were stuck there. So Nora Roberts left romance and started doing her own thing. Carnal Innocence in 1991 is a decent book. And a lot of other authors would come into Harlequin or Silhouette, do a couple of books, and then move on, which is fine. Now, by the mid-'80s, the company was releasing 1,000 books a year. By the mid-'90s, Harlequin was releasing over 1,000 books a year across all of its things in more than 24 languages. And what's interesting is that they had formed their own idea of what was a mystery, of what was a romance. And it wasn't about the success of any individual title. They did market research on that sort of thing, but it didn't really matter as much as the success of the line. I think Harlequin romances are absolutely trashy, even though they're not trashy as far as content necessarily goes. They're utterly lowbrow, and that's absolutely fine. I remember going to a panel at I think it was a Baycon once, and someone said, I would rather have 1 million housewives reading Harlequin romances than not reading at all. It makes sense. And I think the explosion of romance novels we've seen over the past 15 years, in all genres, and things like the rise of romantasy, for example, definitely comes partially out of the Harlequin romance. But I think it also comes partially as a reaction against the Harlequin romance. And when eventually we do our episode on 50 Shades of Grey, which we will, that is as much a reference to and rejection of the Harlequin romances as it is admiration for and aping of the Twilight books. We'll get there eventually, don't worry. But yeah, Harlequin romances, 100% trashy. Next time on Trashy, we're going to look at something I didn't think we'd be doing, but then I realized it's perfect. Because in the 1980s, computers were big. And when something gets big, things get trashy. And such is the case with the Leisure Suit Larry games. So I hope you'll stay tuned. And just remember, if you hate yourself for loving it, it's probably trashy.